Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. Today I'm joined by Juliet Hooker, who is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Social Sciences at Brown University. She is the author of several books, the most recent of which is titled Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. Today she is here to talk to us about uncivil disobedience, protests and multiracial democracy. So we have a question here, Juliet, that we always start with every guest. So in a sentence, what do you see as the biggest single problem facing democracy?
Lying. We are deluged by misinformation and misinformation, and citizens can't have the kinds of discussions they need to about policy if they can't even agree on the facts.
Great, thank you. Lovely and succinct for us as well. So before we dive into your work, I wondered if you would be able to share a little bit about what drew you to political theory and what shaped your interest in questions about democracy.
Yeah, so I think I was drawn to political theory initially by studying feminist theory. It was the experience of taking courses in feminist theory that gave me a language with which to describe experiences that I'd had in my life, or of sexism, or seen in the society around me. But I didn't have the kind of theoretical apparatus to really understand and be able to analyze it in a sort of complex way. And then I took a feminist theory course, and I was like, wow. This is so useful. I now know I wasn't being crazy. I understand why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And I can think about what kind of society I want to live in. And that's the thing that draws me to political theory, that we think deeply about the past, and the present, but we also think a lot about the future and how things should be and what we want them to be.
Amazing, thank you. So perhaps as a bit of an introduction into your own work, we can go via your latest book. So the title again is Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. So the book frames US politics specifically through a lens of black grief and white grievance, and focuses on how in a democracy there are always winners and losers, but these losses are not always distributed equally among everyone. So could you say a little bit more about what the book is about and what motivated you to focus on grief, grievance, and loss in this context?
Absolutely. So the book came about, I started writing it in after a series of events in the United States, which has the Ferguson uprising, the 2016 election, and it was really, for me, a way to think about what were the main forces that were driving racial politics in the United States. And I came to think that people were mobilizing around loss, whether real or imagined, and that this, while, the book doesn't say or argue that Black grief and white grievance are normatively equivalent, one of the things that it's trying to understand is the role of loss in mobilizing people and how it can spur them to political action. And so it really was about trying to think about the implications of these kinds, the ways that people mobilize around loss for democracy. And one of the principal arguments in the book is about how democracies are really demanding in some ways as a form of a system of living together politically, because they require us to accept loss routinely all the time, all of us.
Amazing, thanks. So if we come back to the ideas of grief and grievance for a second, they're quite distinct concepts in your work. Could you explain the difference for maybe our listeners that don't have that kind of concept for them, and maybe even if there are some similarities between grief and grievance as well.
Right. So grief and grievance, they have the same etymological origin from the French term graver. And in part, they are related in the sense that grief, as we think about it, right, is a response to loss. Whereas the difference between grievance is that it is a response to a harm, real or imagined, right? So the distinction that I make between grief and grievance is that, we've all experienced grief, right, at a loss, but grievance is the moment when you move from the experience of grief into feeling like you suffered an injustice and then mobilize in response to it, or you make a demand in response to that injustice.
Great. And do you think this framing reveals anything about the current political moment, either in the US or more generally?
I think it does, right? Because, for example, one of the things that I say in the book about loss is that some losses are political, but not all of them are. And we all experience loss, right? Our favorite sports team loses. We don't get a job that we wanted, or we lose a loved one, right? So loss is ubiquitous in our in human lives, but there is a difference when we think we've experienced a loss that is the result of an injustice. Or, for example, you, of course, still experience a loss if it's the result of something that is a natural disaster. But if the loss is because the government didn't warn you or it allowed people to build homes in unsafe areas, right? There's a way that makes a loss political in the way that I frame it. And so in thinking about the current moment, I think a lot of what we're seeing and not just in the US, is this way in which there are certain kinds of dislocation, some of them economic, some of them because patterns of hierarchy, racial, gender are changing, and people feel dislocated, displaced, right, if they were part of the dominant group. And so often the response to that is to try to cling on, right, and to say, well, this isn't something that I need to accept because it's unfair, or the result of fraud, or the result of people getting jobs unfairly, or an immigrant invasion and they're taking my job, something like that, right? So in that sense, part of what I think the book helps us to think about is how the refusal to accept the loss mobilizes people politically. And I think in the present moment, we're seeing a lot of people who are mobilized by these narratives that don't tell them something like, these are economic dislocations that everybody's suffering, but rather tell them, here's the person to blame for what you're feeling.
Great, thanks. And that was a lovely segue into my next question, actually. So I was wondering if these hierarchies that you've mentioned, gender and race, were the two that you've mentioned there, in US politics, if they've underpinned how we think about ways that we can have disobedience, either civil or uncivil.
One of the things that I think I write about in the book in regard to US democracy is that we've often had the sense, or sometimes people think about democracy in the US as if it's a given, and that progress towards, they misinterpret that famous Martin Luther King line that the arc of history bends towards justice, but actually if it does bend, it's because we're doing the bending. And so part of what the book is charting is the way in which political activism in response to some of these deficits in US democracy has really been instrumental in transforming and undermining some of these longstanding hierarchies that meant that women didn't have, for example, well, the book is particularly concerned about racial hierarchies, but that those changes were the result of political protest and activism, and that often that activism and those protests resulted in backlash as well. So that in terms of going back to the point about progress, right? That progress isn't inevitable, but also progress also triggers backlash.
Great, thanks. In the book subtitle, it's obviously The Politics of Loss. So what makes loss political then in these contexts?
So one of the things that I argue is that losses aren't necessarily, some losses are clearly political, right? So if your candidate loses, if your preferred policy isn't adopted, those are clearly things that we understand as political losses. But there are other losses that become political, as the example I gave before about, state inaction, or if the state, for example, you know, engages in, illegal or unconstitutional acts that create losses for people. That's a political loss. But one of the things that I think is also the way in which loss becomes political is because we don't necessarily recognize everyone's losses right away. I think here about AIDS activism and the way in which, in that moment, it took so much activism for people to really come to understand that the lack of state intervention against the AIDS epidemic was really part of the problem, right? And so people made those losses political through their activism. So that's one of the other things that I point to in the book, that it often takes an enormous amount of work by activists, by ordinary people, for certain losses to become visible and to be seen as political.
So it seems then loss is really important for us to acknowledge. Is there a reason why it would be so important for us to acknowledge in a democracy specifically, rather than just kind of any political structure?
Absolutely, because democracy depends on loss. I mean, this is the great paradox in a way, right? We think about democracy as empowering. You go out there, you mobilize with people who think like you, and your candidate gets elected, your policy gets enacted, you have these amazing victories. But the other side of that is, if you had a victory, the other side of the other sides of the policy in question lost. And assuming that those losses happened fairly, right? That it wasn't because of fraud or the election being rigged, then in order for democracy to function, citizens need to accept justified losses. And I think this is the hard part of democracy, is that we are actually all continually being asked to accept loss. And sometimes one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, in some democracies, some citizens have been asked to accept more loss peacefully than others.
Yeah, great. So on that, you write a lot about how Black loss and grief have been galvanizing, but they also have these costs attached. And you use many examples in your work, one being of Emmett Till. So could you say more about how this works?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that the progress towards racial justice in U.S. democracy has come as the result of Black activism, which has often been galvanized by these sort of spectacular losses, like the death of Emmett Till. But the death of Emmett Till, his lynching, gains the power that it does because his mother decides to have a public funeral, what we would call a political funeral, and thousands of people see, and she insists on it being an open casket funeral and people seeing his body and what was done to him. And this becomes, it's reproduced in magazines around the world, around the US, and it becomes really galvanizing moment for the civil rights movement. And so part of what I try to do in the book is to both show the power of this kind of mobilization around loss, but the cost, right? That Mamie Till Mobley lost her son. She couldn't just grieve him. She had to become a political activist. And she said, she did it because she wanted for his death not to have been in vain. And she felt called by God, literally, she said that, to engage in this activism. But it had enormous costs for her personally. There's a moment when she has a disagreement with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And she's very widely criticized in the Black press. And of course, the white press had been very critical of her because she was exposing this moment of racist violence. And so part of what the book is trying to do is to say, we need to recognize the heroism of people like Mamie Till Mobley, but we also have to think about the enormous cost of that kind of activism and think about how it's not fair in a democracy for us to depend on some people to engage in this kind of heroic activism for us to have progress in ending some of our democratic deficits.
And is there an opposite side to this too then, about kind of celebrating Black life, for example, in the case of Emmett Till?
Yeah, so one of the things that I argue in the book is that one of the things that we need to learn to do is to accept the loss. And one of my worries in terms of Black politics and Black activism is that when and this is not to criticize the families of people who have been killed or the kind of heroic activism they've engaged in, but to recognize that if we recognize the cost of that activism, it also means that that part of people having the space to be fully human would mean that they wouldn't have to do it, that they could simply grieve, and that they and so one of the things that I try to think about there's a chapter in the book on the work of Ida B. Wells and Harriet Jacobs, who are, in Jacobs' case, an anti-slavery activist and abolitionist, and in Wells's case, an anti-lynching activist, suffragist, civil rights activist, and, journalist. And one of the things that I think they do in their work is both compile, right, tell these stories of loss in order to mobilize people against lynching and against slavery, but they also tell the stories of Black life, right? So Black people don't simply become these victims of violence, but they tell the lives that they live. They attend to Black life in a way that I think is really important, so that we don't get this we don't just engage with people once they become victims of injustice.
I think that's a really important point there. And does protest and activism become important in that picture then? Perhaps especially in the case of Black grief and grievance?
I think protest has been one of the central ways in which people have, not the only one, right? So, there's been, for example, legal activism in the case of, very important cases in the civil rights movement in the US, for example, like the Brown versus Board of Education cases, et cetera. But protest, I think, has been a central strategy, in part because one of the things that protest does is make the disparities visible, right? So one of the things that Martin Luther King said about nonviolent direct action is that one of the things that it did was make the violence visible that was otherwise invisible to some people in segregation. Because if people were protesting segregation, even if peacefully, and then the response was this this very outsized and violent response, it made the violence of segregation that was otherwise daily and quotidian visible in a way that turned people against it. So protest has been really, really important for that reason.
Mentioning Martin Luther King there, is there a sort of historical element about how previous movements have often been kind of romanticized, I guess, and portrayed as peaceful and undisruptive?
Absolutely. I think this is very much the case with King himself, and with the civil rights movement in general, where we forget that actually at the time, the civil rights movement, civil rights activists were seen as radical. King himself was seen as, he was called an outside agitator, right? So in retrospect, we say, oh, they protested the right way and they were immediately embraced and that brought change. And that's not what happened. And then because we have this romanticized picture of previous protest movements, then that picture gets used to then criticize contemporary protesters for not being civil, for not following that model, when in fact, even the civil rights protesters who were committed to nonviolence were accused of incivility and were accused of being disruptive. And so, and also, one of the things about this is that being peaceful doesn't mean that you'll be perceived as civil, right? So even civil, peaceful protests can be seen as incredibly disruptive and as uncivil. So that's part of the way in which I think, in retrospect, we have this romanticized account of how people protested, of how people responded to prior protests, that then lead us to have these really unfair expectations of contemporary protesters.
So these kind of uncivil disobedience then, are these a form of legitimate political action, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I think that if you, one of the problems with civility versus, uncivil versus uncivil disobedience is that the line is often in the eye of the beholder, right? So, for example, when athletes have knelt for racial justice more recently, or if that famous picture of the athletes in Mexico City in 1968 who raised their fists, those were seen as incredibly uncivil, but they were totally peaceful. There was nothing disruptive about them, but they weren't perceived at the time in that way. And so I think part of what one of the reasons that we have to refuse in some ways this hard distinction between civil disobedience and uncivil disobedience is that often there are actions that are not going to meet the test, let's say, of what counts as civil disobedience, but that might nevertheless be really important in resisting, for example, unjust behavior. So think about something like sanctuary cities. They're giving sanctuary to people who may be, for example, in the case of immigrants in in the country without legal status. But at the same time, right, there's, during the era of slavery, freed slaves were also given sanctuary, right? So I think, and in fact, even civil disobedience often involves breaking the law. So I think we have these very, this kind of, the problem is that we have this view of civil disobedience that isn't actually very clear about what it might entail, and also that is used then to say all of these actions are beyond the pale, and to regulate protests because not because people are protesting in the wrong way, but because we don't like what they're protesting for or against.
So do you think then there are kind of conditions, I guess, that we can say that civil and uncivil disobedience can meet like a legitimate political action threshold or something like that? Or is it just simply not possible for us to kind of work out what these conditions might be?
Right. So I myself haven't formulated a normative defense of uncivil disobedience, but there are scholars and political theorists and philosophers who have. And, for some of them, the line has to be drawn in terms of physical harm to bystanders, or for example. One of the interesting things is that most of those who have defended uncivil disobedience or rioting are less concerned about property damage, which is often, one of the things that's really interesting is that often the way in which the reason people are very critical of riots is when there is damage to property associated with it. But for some who defend uncivil disobedience, the fact of the matter is that damage to property isn't the same as violence against people. So one of the other conditions would be, are there other ways for people to express their political dissent? And if there aren't, this might be the only avenue. So those are some of the range of things that that people take into account when trying to think about when uncivil disobedience might be justified.
Great, thanks. That was really insightful. So what does all of this mean then for how we should participate in democracy? That's probably quite a big question for you, but
it is a big question. I think the answer in part is that we all have a role to play in democracy, and I think for too long, and I'm going to speak here, I think specifically about the U.S., there was a kind of assumption that U.S. democracy was in pretty good shape, that there were no serious threats to it, and it allowed a certain kind of passivity, I think. A certain sense that, oh, you could go and vote when there were elections, but there was nothing else that you needed to do. And I think one of the things that that the current moment makes clear is that we need to think about democracy as a muscle that we need to, that we need to keep active, that we can't be out of shape as democratic citizens, so to speak, so that, that we need to participate and be engaged. And there's going to be a range of ways to do that. But that we can't, if we want democracy to actually exist, to endure, to function, that it needs the engagement of all of us. And we can't sort of outsource that to some very politically active small group of people.
So this all sounds very kind of collective, I guess. Or is that the way that it should sound, or are there also roles for these individual activists as well?
So I guess what I would say is, there are, I think, so there was a very funny article recently about how, there's supposedly a loneliness epidemic and among young people, and that Gen Zers had actually found the answer to that in volunteering for his campaign, because suddenly they were dating and meeting other people and hanging out. And, that's not I'm not saying this is going to be the payoff of democratic participation, but I do think that there's roles to play for individuals from the very local scale, in the US, for example, and in other places where you might have movements to ban books, being involved with your local library, making sure that there isn't censorship at the level of public schools, of public libraries. That's a really important thing that we can do. And that goes back to my original point about, if we want to have informed citizens, there has to be a place they can go for information. So even those things that seem really small are things that everyday people can do.
Great, thanks. What a lovely kind of full circle, I guess, we've gone
Mhm.
on. So we like to ask some quick-fire questions as well, as part of this podcast. So the first one for you is, whose work inspires you?
So I'm very inspired by all the young people who are, involved in activism right now. And, there is a kind of stereotype that young people are disengaged, or they're apathetic, or they're only on their phones. And instead, when you look around, there's so much enormous activism by young activists who know that this is the world they're going to inherit and are trying to make it better. And that's incredibly inspiring to me.
Lovely point, thank you. And on that, I guess, how do you see the future of democracy evolving?
Well, I think we're in a dark time for democracy globally, actually. Um, but I remain hopeful, and not because I think the outcome is given, but because I think um, if we want to have democracies that work for all, then it means that we all have to build those democracies. And this is the moment in which we find ourselves in. Um, I think it's a real moment where, if, it will require people really thinking deeply and acting accordingly to actually say we're invested in actually living in democracy, and rejecting authoritarianism.
Lovely, thank you. And do you have any reading recommendations then for our listeners if they want to read more about uncivil disobedience in this context?
I do. So, the philosopher Candice Delmas has a book called A Duty to Resist: When Disobedience Should Be Uncivil, and that is a normative defense of uncivil disobedience. And Jonathan Havercroft has an award-winning article, actually, called "Why Is There No Just Right Theory?" where he essentially says, we have a just war theory, why don't we have one for rioting? So those are two good places to start.
Great recommendations. And is there anything our listeners can do, do you think, to make even a small difference to how loss shapes our democracy?
I think one thing that there's two things. One is, for ourselves, when we're in a situation where we could think about the kinds of privileges that we have, and not respond to attempts to let's say, be inclusive, to allow people to participate who haven't participated, as a to see that as a threat to us. So there's a kind of individual component of saying, this, one of the things that I talk about in the book is getting away from this kind of zero-sum thinking of, if someone else gains something, that's a loss for me. So how can we ourselves catch ourselves when we might have that instinctive response of, oh, they're getting something, that must mean that I'm not getting something else, or something is being taken from me. So sort of thinking about being self-conscious of our own, of what's going on in our in our workplaces. When we think about, for parents, the possibilities for children in terms of education, like seeing, approaching things in a different way. In terms of beyond or sort of individual level, I think the other thing is being critical and always being careful when people are trying to give us a sort of convenient person or group to blame for losses we might be experiencing, and being very aware of what kind of work those rhetorics are doing.
Great, thank you. And so, Juliet, I have one final question for you that we ask all of our guests. So, if you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be and why?
I think that one thing that contemporary mass representative democracies have not done well is engage citizens in the work of democracy on a kind of consistent, in a consistent way, right? So often we think about democracy as, oh, every time there's an election, we go out and vote, but we need to think about democracy as more than that. And so one of the things that I think would make our democracies more robust and more functional if there were ways for ordinary people to participate on a more consistent basis in the work of democracy.
Thank you so much. What a lovely point for us to end on, and such a lovely and really interesting conversation today. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. I've been your host today, Jess Sutherland, with our guest Juliet Hooker, and thanks as always for tuning in.